Would you like to introduce the first panel?
Yes. So, our first panel is entitled The State of the Podcast Industry. So, our first panelist is Cheryl King from Markettiers, I think. Did I say that right? MENA, the region's only dedicated broadcast specialist consultancy. Cheryl drives the business that leads the market it's in. So, yeah, I'm not going to go through everything. Hi. Our second panelist is Abdulrahman Al Omran, founder of Podcast Arabic, which is podcastarabic.com. Where is Abdulrahman? Here it is. It's an initiative that aims to promote podcasting in the Arab world and in the market. And he has his own podcast, which is Tiar podcast. So that's Abdulrahman. And our third person is Rami Zeidan from Anghami. Rami is the VP of partnerships at Anghami, working with partners, brands to create new music experiences for music lovers. And our mediator for this is Guido. There he is. Round of applause. Guido is from Publix Communications, a nomad. Really? Okay, a nomad for 15 years of multi-channel brand strategy experiences across MEA. So take it away.
Thank you, guys. Fantastic to be here. As Hiba was saying, this is really the first time we have a community of podcasters around in Dubai, which is fantastic news. I represent Publicis Group, which is one of the largest media conglomerate in the world, and I'm here to learn. Because I think brands, corporations, the media system need to embrace audio and podcast now more than ever. And there is a brilliant community here, and I want to know more about you. And thank you so much for joining me here on this seat, guys. So you have very different backgrounds and very different experience on podcasts. So I will start one by one. Abdulrahman, Riyadh-based, you have a fantastic Twitter account that is spreading the word news about podcasts. You also conduct services, the service that are very much attended, 600-700 answers all the time. You do something. Can you tell me a little bit about what do you see from your point of view from Riyadh and from Twitter about the world of podcasting, how it's evolving, the major trends you experience?
Thank you. In general, we started at 2017. At the beginning of 2017, in the Arab world, not a lot of people understood or knew what podcast was. We tried to educate, we tried to promote podcast, we tried to let people know about the new audio medium. But what we noticed throughout the last 3 years is, what can I say, is like there's been a huge boom in the podcast and the audio market, especially in Saudi Arabia and the GCC. We're also seeing a lot of new podcast networks popping up around the Arab world. The adoption has been amazing. A lot of people are now creating their own content, and like there is a whole new community popping up. And in general, yeah, it's been crazy, to be honest. Like in Riyadh, especially in Riyadh Street, if I walk and ask anyone about podcast, he would know it now, or she would know it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, Cheryl, you are instead one of the only broadcasting, podcasting, marketing, consulting agency that exists, and you're based in Dubai, but you conducted recently a fantastic report about the state of the art. So, what do you see?
Yeah, so I think from our side, we were looking very much from a brand perspective, as you were saying. So I guess our heritage is in audio. That's what we started doing 15 years ago. So at Markettiers, we were looking to, I guess, tell the story of podcasts and how, I guess, crucially, what the opportunity is for brands. We knew that there was this kind of small, sort of burgeoning industry for podcasting in the UAE, but we didn't really have the stats and figures to back it up. So when we were talking about the opportunity for brands, we were saying, well, the first question we get asked is, well, how many people listen to podcasts? How many people are downloading podcasts? And we didn't know, there was literally no statistics to actually canvass the appetite for podcasts. We knew from a global level that 4.3 billion podcasts were downloaded last year. There is a booming market globally, but when it comes to the UAE, it kind of felt like it was been in its infancy. So yeah, that's why we delivered the podcast report into the UAE market. It's the first time it's ever been done. We're definitely keen to kind of roll it out further into different markets. And I was speaking to Abdulrahman before, and we were talking about the boom in a podcast in Saudi. I think what we found for the UAE is that 16% of people are active podcast listeners. So what that means is people are tuning in every week.
6-0.
Sorry, 16. 16.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So it's good to see the appetite that is there, and the fact that it's a very engaged community. There's a lot of trust there. 91% of podcast listeners trust podcasts more than any other medium. So I think we're excited about the opportunity, and it was good just to do the report.
Rami, from your perspective, from Anghami, you are one of the leading, and you are the first in the region. You all stream also other audio content, right? So what would you see the difference between the behavior of the consumer towards music and playlist with regards music versus verbal content?
So, hi everyone. I remember this started in a meeting of 4 people back in April. It's crazy to see where this has come, Anjad. Look, as Anghami, we've always been known to be for the region, from the region. So it was all about trying to amplify the local content, because in this region overall, there's a lot of international content adoption. So on music, for example, half of the streams is international music. In some markets, a little bit more. Which means there becomes some sort of a risk of dilution. When we started with podcasts, we said, well, who listens to podcasts? What are they listening to? The bulk was international. And if you go to the other platforms that are there, it's sort of diluted. So this all started with all right, can we create a platform for the local content creators and sort of push that? And we did that a year ago. What we learned was 3 things. Number 1, we learned that music and podcast may not, and I'm going to use may not because I think it's still a bit early, but may not be compatible to live together or complementary, right? We're seeing heavy users on this side, heavy users on this side, and a very small segment of common users, right? We're seeing that, a lot of the podcasts that start with a search. Almost 70% of people who listen to podcasts on Anghami start by searching for what they want to listen to, versus music, where it's like 40 or 45%. We're seeing a lot of people listening to podcasts in motion. So 15% do that when they're driving, another 15% do that when they're running or walking. So we're starting to see, and all the numbers that we see being reported worldwide, we're starting to see on. But what we also see is that there's also this adoption to international content, and our current hypothesis is there isn't enough content variety in Arabic yet, and people end up falling on international content.
Right.
So with that in mind, the current game of play becomes, number 1, we need to do a lot of manual editorial. The whole algorithm, machine, personalization at this stage in the streaming world is fluff. Because there isn't enough content for the machine to learn, right? So, and then in the podcasting world, unlike music, every podcast is in like 7 categories. So when you're talking to the machine, you're like, hey, I'm music, and I'm culture, and I'm art. Oh, what are you?
It's too broad.
Yeah, so the machine goes, you do it, right? So there, it becomes a game of really working very closely with the podcasters. And my message here today is, your podcast is probably on Anghami, it probably is not yet. You probably put your podcast on Anghami and you aren't seeing numbers yet. But there are 2 things here. Number 1, we're designing the product to drive podcast listenership, and we just launched a marketing campaign 3 days ago, so the product is ready. We've changed the player. There's a lot of things that we had to do to drive that. And number 2, the podcasters that are talking to us are allowing us to be aware of what's out there. So when someone calls us and say, hey, it's Ramadan and I did a podcast for Ramadan, we're going to push that because we're aware of it, right? hey, we launched our first Arabic, we did this with a musician, that an interview. We'll start pushing and understanding, because the more we know, the more we're specific in our testing. And the less we know, the more we're generic and sort of trying to push everything out and saying, nothing's working.
That's a fantastic point. Going to this, there is still a lack of inventory, so we need more categories, more content verticals, and probably lack of understanding of behaviors of the listenership. So, and this is a question for you guys. Where do you see the most promising content verticals, the things that the region is very good at producing, and where we are lacking, and where people is going abroad to find out the right content verticals? And then in terms of distribution, is still the strategy of, I need to be everywhere, because the behaviors are different platform, different apps, so I need to put my podcast everywhere? Or do you think that we're going to go to a specific platform for a specific piece of content? So on the content vertical.
So giving the content, so in general, I would say like, because it's an emerging and a new industry, a lot of content creators are focusing on interview style podcasts, where in fact, like we're seeing in the global podcast content, you would see a lot of variety. And in general, I would say like one of the biggest missing pieces of the Arabic podcasts is the storytelling aspect. We're still not seeing enough storytelling, which there is a huge demand. Like Arab content, and Arabs are huge consumers of storytellings. It's one of the most effective way to reach, especially Arab audience. So yeah, I would say definitely storytelling is one of the definitely most missing current podcast content.
Let's go a quick turnaround again.
And yeah, I think, and to add to that as well, in terms of the verticals, what we see is there's a massive trend. I think perhaps, Rami, we were speaking about this a few months ago. Like there's a big trend for comedy. There's a trend for lifestyle. It's the kind of lighter sort of topics, as well as the kind of hard-going, informative topics that people are listening to. I think when it comes to the distribution strategy, I guess what our sort of thinking is that you can create the most amazing content, you can have the biggest celebrities on your podcast ever, but if you don't tell people about it and people aren't aware, then how are they going to know to search? So what I like about podcasts is you're not an accidental listener. You don't stumble upon a podcast. You actively have to look out for it and type it in the search. So if you're looking for podcasts on marketing, you're typing in those keywords into podcasts. But there's so many podcasts that exist. So on iTunes alone, there's 700,000 podcasts. So once you've got your podcast, kind of how do you distribute it? So what hosting platforms do you look at? Do you go international, Spotify, or do you go local? Do you put it on everything and hope for the best? I think you kind of need to work out which horse do you back. But I guess with that in mind, it's interesting, and I think where the interesting point is looking at consumer and audience behavior. So getting into the mindsets of audiences, what are they listening to? What is their behavior? What platforms are they listening to? I think the good thing about this region is that, yes, we have the big global podcasts like This American Life and Serial, but I think the podcast that will win big is the local providers. And I think the fact that we see Anghami doing so well in region is testament to the fact that this massive burgeoning market for Arabic content and for local providers. A third of podcasts are in Arabic already, which is great to see. And I think 91% of people that listen to a podcast finish it. So you're tapping into a very engaged audience. I think the opportunity is distribution, and how do you get your podcast out there? From a brand perspective, whenever we're speaking to brands that want to sort of dabble in podcasts, they often come to us and say, we'll just do a one-off episode, we'll just do a pilot and see how it goes. And that's the problem. Like, you can't just do one podcast and expect success. You need to kind of be in it to win it, and you need to be brave. So I think the opportunity is for kind of longer, sustained content. You need to understand, like the Do Count show, for example, I think they only had like 300 listeners for the first 6 months. So you need to understand that to create a sustained podcast and it to be successful, you need to be in it for the long run.
Yeah, sure, Abdulrahman.
So one of the things I noticed is I worked with almost 50 new podcasts. So we had our own studio, and where we helped podcasters start. And what I noticed is it's not really about the platform. It's about like social media. So everyone has their own platform that they listen to. But in order to gain new audience and in order to obtain listeners, we noticed that the podcasters who effectively do social media are the ones that gaining traction and like getting listeners. And to add that, we actually did a survey for our community and 500 participants, and they said that 60%, or it showed that 60% of people discover new podcasts through social media, especially Twitter. So Twitter is actually the medium to gain new listeners.
They give you source of plays and source of downloads.
Yeah, to discover new podcasts.
Absolutely.
So I have 3 messages for everyone here. Number 1, before we talk distribution, distribution is an element of marketing, right? So I think every podcaster group needs to go back and really put together their marketing strategy. And I say that because, so I personally started a podcast so I can learn the process that you go through. And I commend everyone here on the power of storytelling. It's not easy. It takes me 6 weeks to write 1 episode about hip hop, and then I've been a hip hop head for forever. So please don't take whatever I'm going to tell you as falsafa. So I really think everyone should really think about their marketing strategies. When you talk about social media, Big Hass and I on Howell on Hip Hop Podcast, we have 50,000 plays on Instagram, 5,000 plays on SoundCloud, and shamelessly, I'll work on it, 500 plays on Anghami, right? But the gameplay here is because people were able to connect and listen to samples that we were doing. We have an easier way because we were talking about celebrities, but I think overall how you bring your content to life and how you show yourself as a person to get people to connect with you as a human, not as the artwork of your podcast. I think you need to think about your marketing before you think about distribution platforms, and then whatever you're pushing. If you're pushing in Saudi and Anghami is the biggest, people are going to go there. If you're pushing a very intellectual topic, people may go to SoundCloud because that's where intellects go. So that's on distribution and marketing. My second message is on the content, and I think the way I describe podcasts now is like we described hip-hop in the 70s. It's very underground. It's very intellectually driven. It's about sophistication. It's about very educated people talk about big social matters and interviews and shedding the lights on people that are making a difference in the world. And I think eventually, once all of that is said, things will evolve, and we're seeing a lot of podcast groups sort of maintain the mainstream. Going mainstream means starting to create content for the mainstream. Right? So 35% of people who listen to podcasts on Anghami are under 21, right? They're not going to resonate with a lot of the content that's out there. So the 25 to 35 and the millennials are the people we're talking to, but they want to hear entertaining content and stuff that can make them laugh or chill or whatever. So the third point I want to make is a personal opinion. And I think, and I was talking to someone earlier on, and don't shoot me for this, and I hope the press doesn't pick it up, but I think the term podcast is outdated, right? And I say that because everybody's creating shows, and everybody's creating documentaries, and everybody's creating talk shows or fun program. What's different between an audio show and a video show and a YouTube show? So it's I'm a YouTuber or I'm a podcaster. You're a content creator, right? What is the genre of entertainment that you're in, and that can live across multiple platforms? I think podcasts will turn into 3 things. Number 1, it'll be the new face of journalism. Print is dead. So podcasts or audio shows will be the new face of journalism. Number 2, I think on serial and movies and storytelling, that will be the next frontier. The easiest thing to create now is a monologue or an interview, so that's doing great. And I think as we all gain more experience, storytelling and more of that's going to come. And what's going to come off the second point or the third point is the broadcast mainstream media are going to start coming to the podcasting community to pick up stories to produce. Because if you also look at the Arabic industry overall in entertainment, music, film, or whatever it is, the local productions are becoming less and less and less and less. So podcasts may play, or I believe it will play, a very big role in sort of redefining how the industry works, from audio, which is cheap, easy to produce, to becoming something. And we started seeing that worldwide, but I think that will come in specifically because the Arabic scene is an empty slate.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's very interesting. I think it's so dense, this conversation. We have so many points that we scratch upon, and we would need hours, the last 5 minutes for the last round. So building on this, I think we were losing as an industry the naivety of being avant-garde, as you said, being really into niches, but we need to reach the maturity, and all you guys, 50% of you create content and would love to make probably this a paying the bill business for you. So it would be a profession. How do we conquer that space? Because I represent all the big brands and the big marketing spending, and we're spending close to zero on you guys, which is a problem. So we need to exit the space and go to a mainstream that not necessarily is an evil space. It's a space that's talk to larger amount of people, probably touch upon the nerves of society in a more refined way, because you need to speak to more people and touch sensitivities and be much more conscious that you have an ecosystem that is broader and more complex. So how do we reach that moment in time in which we become a mature industry and we really consolidate our space as content creators? Which in Saudi particularly, there is a thriving industry that probably accelerates more than anybody else.
Okay, so regarding this point is, and let's be frank, if we look into the US podcasting industry, which is leading the whole world industry in terms of podcasts, you would see that there is not a lot of major big global brands are adopting podcasts, and all of the current brands that supporting podcasts are startups. In the US, we see startups with a huge budget, huge funding, and they have the capability to actually support podcasts. But we are still not seeing global brands adopting podcasts. And to be honest, I'm not seeing it in the Arabic podcast or MENA region too. Like if global brands are not adopting it, I'm not seeing local brands are adopting it too. And unfortunately, we don't have the enough startup ecosystem to actually support us like the US. In the US, the startup ecosystem are actually supporting podcasts. You see Squarespace doing it. You see a lot of big brands. But here, we are not seeing it yet. So in my personal opinion, in the next 5 years, and we're still not going to see any adoptions in terms of big brands, to be honest. But that doesn't mean that we need to stop or something like that.
Interesting point. There are podcasts like McDonald's Secret Sauce that are mainstream, and at the same time, there is the Avant-Garde, 2 hours, I Profile, I Value.
So I have a different view, an extended view. So how old is podcast worldwide? 20 years? 2005, so 15 years. It took hip-hop 20 years to become mainstream. And I talk a lot about hip-hop because I've just recently studied it. But the point that I want to make here is we came as a community a year ago together. The good news is, in MENA, we always skip a phase. So we went from analog TV to Netflix, and we went from CDs and tapes to Anghami, and we went from radio to podcasts. So the good news is I don't think we're going to need 20 years, but what we did last year, the last 12 months as a podcast community, is we activated the community. And activating the community allowed us to grow. That's number one. Number two, and I'm trying to talk to many people, but it's easier said than done. But number two, I want to see a collective coming together. I want to see 5 people handling distribution, marketing, and connection and PR for everybody. Why don't we have a label for podcasts, right? Because I don't believe that you can create content and market it and distribute it and build connections and talk to people and get money. You're not Superman, right? So Superwoman. So that body needs to be created. So on Anghami, we're doing 3 things on monetization. So first, we need to get the people on the audience and the listenership, so we'll get there. The second thing we're doing is we don't want to sell, when women win alone, right? Because then we're saying, hold on down. If your brand fit is not like Rana, then you can't sponsor it. But we want to talk about anything that has to do with women empowerment and things that relate to female. Then I have 7 podcasts, and instead of having 10,000 or 15,000 listeners, I have 150,000 listeners. So I give advice to everyone here in the room. When you want to go to approach brands, and hopefully we get there, when you go on your own, you're teaching the marketing community to match the brand fit with your podcast. And that's limiting because the number of downloads you have, globally it's 20,000 downloads per podcast, average. So eventually the numbers are not gonna stack up for a marketeer who wants reach, right? So we're going to start optimizing audio ads and all of that on the collective of audience. So 18 to 34 females, what do they listen to? It's none of your business. They're going to listen to podcasts. We're going to reach them. We're going to slip in there. We're going to pay the money. The second thing I see, because we are in an empty slate and an opportunity to create content, we're going to start creating a lot of content for brands. So we're pitching to McDonald's, let's create a food trust podcast, because they have that PR program, right? We're pitching to Dubai Fitness Challenge, let's do a fitness challenge and a fitness podcast that talks to the layman people of how to get fit, Arabic and English. We're focusing on Arabic content creation because in Arabic content creation, we're one of 50, and international, we're one of 700,000, right? So content creation is something big. So if you're building the infrastructure to create more content, please continue doing that. And the third thing I see is once there's more mainstream content, and I think there's a lot of young creative people, once we get there from a content variety perspective, the numbers are gonna come and the money will come, right? Because versus 15 years ago, audio was not as scaled as it is now. It took Spotify 10 years to get to where it is. It took us 7 years to get where we are as Anghami. So audio is ready. The technology is ready. It's missing content, right? And enough content to get the machine to start pushing through. So just to summarize, I think, number one, focus on your marketing strategy. Talk to us. If you don't talk to us, there's a lot of people in this room. It's very hard for me to know what's out there, so please do talk to us. Number three, I think it's very promising, and year one, we activate the community. Year two, let's bring it to life, come together more and do more initiatives together instead of once a year. And then number three, just keep creating content and don't stop. So that would be my summary.
I was just going to say, just to add to the points as well, I think what excites us about this market is the speed of adoption. So although 15%, I think, of the UAE class themselves as regular podcast listeners, we're not that far behind other more mature markets. So the UK, US, South Korea, all of those markets that have huge kind of podcast listener numbers. The fact we're on such a high figure already, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see a very different landscape in the region as well. So I think that's exciting. Even from a brand perspective, we know like Oracle, for example, they've appointed their first chief podcast officer. So that's amazing. The fact that they have their own podcast guy that's actually responsible for all of that. And then I think even from an internal comms perspective, we're speaking to Dubai airports about doing something there. Also, Majid Al Fateh are active in the podcast community. I think it will win big because we are a mobile-first region. And that's a huge one. And let's look at kind of the trust in the longer form format, the fact that the commute time in the region as well is typically around 45 minutes. You've got this dead time to listen to a podcast every day. I think it's always going to win. So I think this is an interesting time for the podcast industry itself. It's not new. It was, as you say, been going since 2004, but there's a renaissance now. It's fashionable. It's radio on demand, and I think the region's ready for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Guys, it was a very engrossing conversation, so dense, so many topics. I would leave now the floor for 10 minutes of questions. Probably, if I need to summarize everything in one word, would be ecosystem. Like, we're all in here together, and we need to represent all the different components of the journey to deliver your content to an audience and support you through the production phases and distribution phases, and the technological aspect as well, the Alexa, the Google, the Amazon of this world. The marketing is evolving to voice, and your content will be one of the first to stumble upon the queries. So really, really think ecosystem, and up to you guys. So 5 minutes of questions. Who want to be the first? I'm really scared.
Does this work? Oh, it works. Fabulous.
I'm impressed already.
This is Salim Bashir from podcast Qafir. Hello, everybody.
Welcome.
I'm glad to be here. A question for Cheryl. Is that right? Is the pronunciation right? Okay. When can we see statistics for the region? How can we? I'm here to. I mean, we're all here to see some statistics that would help us to market our content, that would help us to reach companies, brands, etc. Reach also wider audience. how can we all help together as we are all here in this room to make that statistics?
Yeah, definitely, and that's a good question. And with the podcast report we did initially, because we were just sort of testing the water with it, we wanted to find out a big core to work with. We looked at the UAE first, but absolutely next year we'll be repeating the podcast report to look at again how things have moved on and how things have changed in the UAE, but then also rolling it out across the region as well. So I think from speaking to lots of people in the room today and finding out the boom of podcasting in Saudi and then looking at other nations as well, it's going to be so interesting to look at the kind of differences between regions. You know, how many people are downloading podcasts, what type of content are people listening to at the moment, because it's still kind of in our relative infancy. It's been good just to get an initial kind of grounding, because we know the appetite is there. So yeah, absolutely, we'll be looking to roll it out across the region.
Okay, mic check. First of all, thank you so much, right here, Cheryl. Thank you so much for this amazing, really. Quick question maybe for Abdulrahman and maybe all of you guys as well. Do you think the Arab region is ready to pay to listen to a podcast? Because that will be something as well that we can support with. I know a friend of mine in the States asked for $3 to listen to the podcast. She started free, but then now if you want the good thing, you got to pay for it. So I think that, do you think that will ever happen? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I have always thought about this, and I asked, we do a survey every year for our community, and they told us, like, we asked them, would you support your favorite podcaster, like in platforms like Patreon or something like that? And 30% of them said, yeah, we would support them. And like most of them said we would be like open to supporting them from $5 to $10. That being said, 30% is a great percentage in terms of support, but to be honest, I have seen podcasts try to do it. Podcasts with a big audience try to do it, and it didn't really work for them right now. I see it working in the future, but so far I haven't seen anyone successfully does it, even the big podcasts, to be honest.
Yes. We're here all day, so yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Cheers.